Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I understand that there have been some metro problems, so there could be some people filtering in over the next few minutes, but we have a hard stop at 11, so we want to start as on time as we can. So thank you very much for coming this morning. I know it's a cold and wet and early Monday morning, so much appreciation for coming over here to join us. My name is Michael Kugelman. I think most of you know me. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia here at the Wilson Center. This morning we'll be discussing the media environment in India, including the various challenges and pressures in this media environment and what might be driving them. In truth, this is really a conversation that one can have about many different countries in the world. Media environments everywhere face challenges and pressures, and in many countries these days there are very real concerns about press freedoms, hate speech and media content, fake news, among other things. So I think the question is, why have this conversation about India? And let me just briefly offer three reasons. One, first of all, India has one of the biggest media markets in the world. We're talking about a country with thousands of newspapers, hundreds of TV channels, untold numbers of news websites. It's a media market of very considerable import, and so what's happening in it is worth talking about. Second, India is a country with democratic traditions, and it so often brands itself as the world's largest democracy, and a free and open press is, of course, a pillar of democracy. And third reason why we should be having this conversation about India, in our view, is that this is it's regarded as an important country for the U.S. and U.S. interests. Washington has been pursuing a strategic partnership with New Delhi for quite some years. It's a relationship that's often been defined by both sides, not just by its shared geostrategic interests, but also by its shared democratic values. So this is a conversation worth having, and we really have a great panel this morning to be leading it. First of all, we have with us Neha Dixit, who is a New Delhi-based independent journalist. She is a 2019 recipient of the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award, a very prestigious award which she'll be receiving, I think, on Thursday. Is that correct? She's covered politics, gender, social justice for more than a decade. She's published her work with the New York Times and Washington Post, among other places. She's won a number of other journalism awards as well, including the Kurt Schork Award in International Journalism, and she was also a Knight Fellow at the International Center for Journalists. She'll describe the challenges that she's faced through her work as an independent journalist in contemporary India. Second, we have with us Alia Iftikhar. She's the senior Asia researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and she's previously held positions at the Middle East Institute and the State Department, among other places. And she'll talk about the latest research carried out by CPJ related to press freedoms, with some emphasis on the situation in Kashmir, I believe. Third, we have with us Irfan Nuruddin. He's director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. He's also a professor at Georgetown University, where he has directed the India Initiative, which is a terrific initiative that's advanced research and teaching around India. He's published a number of notable works, including Elections in Hard Times and Coalition Politics and Economic Development. Maybe most importantly, he's a former Wilson Center Fellow, so it's always good to welcome back our alumni to the Wilson Center. He'll step back and highlight the political context and dynamics in India today that may be impacting the media environment today. And then fourth and finally, we'll hear from Shanti Kalathil. She's the Senior Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and her work focuses primarily on authoritarian challenges to democracy in the information age. She's previously held positions with USAID and the Carnegie Endowment, Georgetown University, and she was also a reporter with the Asian Wall Street Journal. And her publications include Diplomacy, Development, and Security in the Information Age, among others. And she'll really be the big picture person. She'll place India in a broader global context and offer some analysis of media trends worldwide. So with that said, we'll start with brief comments from each of the panelists, and then we'll go to a discussion. So we'll start all the way to my right and work the way back here. So Neha, please start us off.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'll try to stick to the time that I've been allotted. Okay, so I'm an investigative journalist. I'm based in Delhi, but in the recent past, let's say in the last 5.5, 6 years, it's been increasingly difficult for journalists in India to be able to put out any kind of ground report, any kind of investigative report which has facts and evidence so that can be debated in the public domain. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have an increasingly corporatized media with a structure, with a corporate political nexus in it, which gives space to opinion, which is actually also a global trend. So there's more space for opinion journalism rather than ground reports that can actually directly be critical of the government or point out what is going on the ground, instead of some people coming up with selective facts and then the government being able to conveniently dismiss it as somebody's individual opinion. So having said that, in 2016, I had done a story for the Outlook magazine. It was a 4-month-long investigative piece where I found out that the right-wing Hindutva nationalist groups in Northeast India had trafficked 31 tribal girls between the age group of 3 to 11. And they were taken away from 5 districts in Assam in Northeast India, and they were taken to Gujarat and Punjab, which is several thousand kilometers away from the place of these girls. So this was the initial tip that I had got, and then one found out that the state Commission for Protection of Child Rights in Assam had pointed out that this is child trafficking. There's a Supreme Court order in India where you cannot take children away from their place of residence, even for the purpose of education. And these parents had handed over these girls to the right. So this is RSS, and RSS is the parent body of the current party in power, which is BJP. I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And RSS had different units working in Northeast India, which was the educational wing, which is Vidya Bharati, the women's wing, which is the Rashtra Sevika Samiti, and then there is the welfare wing, which is Seva Bharati. So these 3 units coordinated and identified these 31 tribal girls from the remotest parts. And the parents were told, because these were really marginalized sections and really completely deprived of basic amenities, the parents were promised that the girls would be provided free education and lodging. But once the girls were taken away in 2015, the parents just couldn't get in touch with their daughters any longer. And apart from that, their pictures, all their identity papers, everything was taken away. And these are such remote parts that when you take away something like that, the parents don't even have any way to prove that they had these daughters at all who were taken away. So basically, this is the information I got, and I corroborated it from 3 different places. So the parents told me the same thing. I found out documents from the government, from various statutory bodies, calling it child trafficking and asking these Hindu fundamentalist groups to send the girls back, but no attention was paid to it, in complete violation of various national and international laws, including the UN Convention on Protection of Child Rights that India is a signatory to. So then I managed to trace the girls in Punjab and Gujarat. So 20 of them were in Gujarat, 11 in Punjab. The girls, again, very young, were in the last, so I met them 1.5 years since they were taken away. They were not allowed to speak in their local languages, so which means Bodo and Assamese, which were their local languages. They were told to stop conversing in that, and instead they had to talk in Hindi and Gujarati. And again, there was no formal system of education that they were part of. Instead, they had these bhajan and sanskar rituals, classes in Hindu rituals. Also, this young girl, 7-year-old girl, whose parents I had met in Assam, and they were looking for her. She told me that now she's completely vegetarian, and she would like to conduct self-immolation, because that is what Hindu women should do to protect their honor from Muslim invaders and Christians. So there was all of that happening. And while I was doing that, in the process, in these 4 months of reporting this story, at various points I was physically stopped by RSS members, both in Assam, like in Gujarat, I was locked up inside this seminary where these girls were. And the problem is I'm an independent journalist for the last 7 years. I don't have a press card, so there is no way to prove that I'm a journalist. So for a minute, I thought maybe I should Google what I do, but then I thought, bad idea, they shouldn't what I actually do. So yes, and eventually I was let off because this guy, this person who was heading this seminary said that, oh, you're a Brahmin woman, so you wouldn't do anything wrong, so maybe you should go. So that's how I was let off. But again, there was all these stories. Similarly, in Punjab, I traced the girls. Once the story was out on 4th of August in 2016, there were, for the first few days, it was circulated. Lots of people read it. There was lots of reactions, and we're all used to that. It happens in India. It happens everywhere. The same trolling, the death threats, the rape threats, anything. My residential address was put out, family members, photos, anything that you can imagine, in the incited stone pelting, all of that. But they also filed 2 cases. So we have this archaic law called the criminal defamation law from the colonial times. So you can be imprisoned for defaming somebody. So that is a case that is currently against me, but also another case which is for inciting communal hatred, also filed by RSS and the additional Solicitor General of the Guwahati High Court, which is, again, so basically the state was involved in filing this case. Now it's been 3 years, it's on, but I would like to say it is not just me. Several journalists in India are facing this, that the cases are filed far away. The new pattern in this current regime is that apart from the defamation cases, they also file a criminal case along with it against journalists. And that makes it not just a press freedom issue, but they can always manipulate it and say that there's something else, some crime against on the side going on. So that is a new pattern. So I have to travel 1,000 kilometers every month almost to attend the court hearings. The organization that published my story is not supporting me, and this is not, again, me alone. Most journalists in India facing legal cases have no organizational support. Again, last year I had done, how much? Do I have 5 minutes?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, again, last year, again, I did a series of stories on the extrajudicial killings by the police in India, where 150 people were. So we have something called police encounters. In popular parlance, police shootouts are called police encounters in India. And we figured that, so we have a Hindu monk called Yogi Adityanath as the chief minister of one of the most populated state in India, which is Uttar Pradesh. And since he came into power, he was very proud of the fact that in the first 6 months of his government's achievements, he put out that there were 150 police encounters. 72 people were killed. So I investigated that most of the people who were killed were either Dalits or Muslims from extremely socioeconomically marginalized backgrounds, for accusations as if they've stolen a gold ring, stolen 8,000 Indian rupees, and most of the family members were not given postmortem reports. So I managed to find out the pictures of the dead bodies, which clearly showed that it was not a chance encounter, but they were actually held by the police, beaten up, skull is broken, eyes coming out, so all of that stuff. And then one figured out that these were not chance encounters, but people were selectively from certain communities identified by the police and killed. So again, after the story, again, the cops have been threatening me, and they keep regularly telling me that they know where my family members live. So that has been a situation, but just let me stop at this point that we are living in times where the government, anyway, it's a post-truth world where it's just opinion and no facts and evidence, but the government is also not just targeting individuals, but they're also looking at, they don't want journalists to talk about certain issues which are off their agenda. They don't want you to talk about Dalits, they don't want you to talk about the marginalized, they don't want to talk about minorities. So the idea is not just specifically targeting journalists, but also creating an atmosphere where you cannot talk about the marginalized, when you cannot talk about people who are not part of the Hindutva agenda right now in India. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaliyah, we go to you.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Well, thank you to Michael and Wilson Center for hosting us. But everything that Neha is talking about is really unfortunately a broader trend that we at CPJ are seeing in the media environment in India. Largely, a number of criminal cases, defamation cases being filed against either individual journalists or any outlets that have dared to continue to report critically in large fines. And one thing I do want to know is it's not just about the threat of imprisonment when these cases are filed. These cases, when defamation cases or these criminal charges are filed against journalists in India, that itself is a form of harassment because the legal system can be quite slow. In Neha's case herself, her case has been going on for 3 years now. That's not just hers, that's dozens and dozens of journalists who have been fighting legal cases for many years. It can be a huge drain financially to travel to these courts to appear for your court hearings. And mainly, it also takes away time from journalists and media outlets that are trying to do their job, which is reporting. That itself is something we view as a form of harassment. Broadly, I want to take a little step back and I'm going to shift my focus more to Kashmir, which I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with what's happening there. But I would view the past, we're going on more than 100 days of an information restrictions. For a large majority of that, it was a complete communications blackout, unprecedented in many ways, in which TV channels, phone lines, landlines, post office, everything was shut down. There was really no way to get information out of the region and very little way for people within the region to access information. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest threats to press freedom, not just in India, but internationally right now. Setting the precedent that, a country that calls itself the world's largest democracy can completely cut off an entire region from access to information or ability to communicate. I want to talk about, though, Neha's talked about this a bit in the past, that, this current government seems to have a disdain for media, for journalists, for any reporting that doesn't fall in line with its agenda. But I would also argue that this current ruling party is quite intelligent in the way it tries to manipulate the media environment to stick to its agenda. And we've also seen what we're seeing right now really is access to information being weaponized. So what happened when that predated, this communications blackout? What's going on in Kashmir right now? I'm not really here to talk about what happened with Article 370 or, any of those changes to the status quo in Kashmir, but I will lay it out. The day before this change was announced, the day before it was announced that Article 370 was going to be revoked, was when the communications blackout started. It was implemented very strategically in a way that meant that the people who were being most affected by this policy change were not even able to find out that this was happening. So not only, were stakeholders, constituents not consulted, they didn't even have a way to find out what had happened. And so, I think that just is a question I keep coming back to, is what kind of democracy is that? And, over the past 100+ days now, there's been a promise from government officials that the region will be restored to normalcy, that, access will be granted. But the question I keep asking them is, how long? how long can you keep an entire region, 8 million plus people, under a complete blackout and completely curtail any voices coming out of the region? And that's really what this is all about, ultimately, is that India very much wants to control the narrative around Kashmir. That's a trend that is not limited to this ruling party. It's past administrations. It's not a new tactic. And one of the biggest arguments I've heard, and I was in India for the month of September, is that this level of restrictions, yes, is extreme, but it is necessary in order to promote law and order, that there haven't been violent instances, and that really is what the Indian government is continuing to argue. But unfortunately, everything that we are hearing, the information that we are getting from the region, isn't aligning with the government's claims. And that is really the core of this issue, is that we don't have a full picture of what is happening in Kashmir. The government is not forthcoming with information or facts from the ground, and we're being denied the truth, ultimately. So my colleague was on the ground in Kashmir in early September. We chose to send our colleague there largely because we weren't getting information. I'm sure many of you, if you have friends or sources in the region, know that the only time we were getting any news from Kashmir was if journalists were able to leave the region physically, either carrying colleague stories on pen drives or themselves leaving to get internet access to be able to file stories or photos. And that means that those journalists either have the means to leave, they have a organization backing them, giving them those resources. So we chose to go in. We had a few days on the ground where my colleague met with dozens of journalists, editors, and what we found was really, really chilling and quite disturbing. There's a very high environment of fear and self-censorship in the region right now. Much of that is stemming from the fact that there have been hundreds and hundreds of political arrests, and the people who have been arrested include many people who are viewed in the region as being pro-India. And many of them are detained under the Public Safety Act, which means you can be held indefinitely without trial for up to 2 years. So it sent a very clear message that no one in the region is safe. And people are afraid to report. They're afraid of what may happen to them if they report the reality on the ground. There's no direct censorship, I can put it that way, in the way that the state or politicians or anyone is not directly telling journalists what to write, but they're creating an environment that makes it incredibly difficult. So there's, of course, basic access that you need to be able to report: internet, phones. It's very difficult. There's one government media center that's been set up. It has a handful of computers for the 100+ journalists that work in the valley. And beyond that, what I'll also point out is that much of the information or the news reporting that has come out of Kashmir at this point is largely centered in Srinagar. So we're hearing really what's happening in the biggest city in the region, and not on the outskirts, not in the district areas. And when my colleague was there, editors told him that many of them hadn't heard from any of their district reporters for the past month because there had been no way to get in touch with them. And movements, it's an enforced curfew, so they're not necessarily able to leave those regions. So we're also, from the news and what we have been able to see thus far, is also limited and restricted to essentially one city. And if I have a couple more minutes, I want to just highlight one case specifically, and then I'm would be more interested to hear what questions the audience has, but I do want to talk about Kazi Shibli. So if you aren't familiar with him, he is a local editor. He edits a digital news site called the Kashmir. And Kazi Shibli reported about a week before the removal of Article 370 that there were increased troop deployments coming into the valley. He was detained on July 26th, and at that time he was being held in the central jail in Srinagar. After the communications blackout was instituted, when the family went to try to go meet him again, they were told that he had been transferred out of the state to Agra. His brother traveled to Agra, couldn't find him. He was then told, okay, he's being held in Benares. His brother then traveled to Benares, still couldn't find him. At this point, it was late August, and the family at that time, about a month after he'd been detained, received official notice that he was being held under the Public Safety Act. So, at this point, his news website published an article asking for help trying to identify his location. The family is among the restrictions trying to get information on where their son, where their brother is being held. And ultimately, on September 26th, 2 months after he'd been detained, he was found in a jail in Bareilly in Uttar Pradesh, which is where he's currently being held. So that's about 620 miles from his hometown in Anantnag. And I'm highlighting this case because it really represents what one person, so there's hundreds of arrests right now, but one journalist, the situation he's facing, a complete denial of due process, legal rights. His family wasn't able to get him a lawyer until they found where he was being held. And then in the restrictions, with the communications restrictions, it's very hard to be able to go to the courts to file the right documents, to get a legal process going, to get him legal representation. So he's still being held, and we do at CPJ think it is in retaliation for his reporting. And I'll wrap it up by just saying that, amidst all of the ongoing restrictions, I think something that in South Asia or even in India itself, Kashmir is viewed as a very extreme situation. It's viewed as, okay, it's a conflict zone, you have to do extreme things in extreme situations. This isn't something that would affect or happen in the rest of the country. It's not something that would affect or happen in the rest of the region. But over the years, I think in my reporting, what I've heard from local journalists, local human rights activists, is Kashmir really has been kind of a laboratory or a testing ground for India to test out new tactics and see what works, what doesn't work. And historically, this has proven true, especially if you look at the media environment. So pressing criminal charges as well as defamation, manipulating government advertising, these are tactics actually that we could first see in Kashmir decades ago that now are being seen, being used across the country. So I would really argue that there is an extremely dangerous precedent right now that is being set in which there's a complete erosion of democratic norms as well as constitutionally guaranteed rights to, what is now a union territory, Indian citizens, and it absolutely presents a danger to the rest of the country.
Thank you, Aliyah. Irfan, over to you.
Good morning, and thanks, Michael, for the invitation to be back at the Wilson Center. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack because unlike my colleagues on the right of me, I have no experience in journalism. I don't have the guts that they do. So I prefer to be an academic, sit and think and write about these issues. But so what I'm going to do is take the prerogative of sort of maybe setting this in a slightly broader context. I want to make 3 points. The first is that the press, when it works, is counter-majoritarian, as are most of the supporting institutions of democracy. This is very difficult. It's not just difficult in India, it's difficult all over the world, because to be counter-majoritarian means that you're always making enemies, not just of the powerful, but in fact of those who support the powerful. So I want to unpack that in a second. The second, and Aliyah kind of just mentioned it in passing at the very end, is thinking about the business model of the press and what this means for India in particular, and the role of politicians in being major stakeholders in media organizations, and the role of government tendering and advertisements in setting the tone and agenda for the press. And then the final is really thinking about the age of nationalism in which we find ourselves at this point in time, and what this means. So essentially, is Kashmir the canary in the mine shaft for India, or is there a case to be made that Kashmir is in fact different, and that the lessons from Kashmir, as disturbing and completely sort of embarrassing for India's democracy as they are, may not necessarily portend sort of that all of India's media is going to be collapsing around us in the coming future. So it's 3 different points. But before I start that, let me also just ask that we be a little critical about saying, when we say media environment, what exactly are we talking about, right? Because if I think about media environment as Arnab Goswami and Republic TV and 15 talking heads, Michael and I occasionally, 2 of those, right, all yelling at each other, it's very hard to have any optimism about India's media. But if you think about the media environment as including vernacular press, local journalists in small towns and cities across India, bringing stories about the plight of farmers, the corruption and the nexus of corruption between local politicians and local bureaucrats and business and corporate interests, and the access that those very brave journalists have to getting their stories out because of the democratization of the internet, the role of Twitter, the availability of websites as a way of telling the stories. I think there's a much more optimistic story to be told. At least there's reason for hope, right? That the bulk of the media, without denying all the incredible difficulties that journalists in any of those domains face, but the bulk of those media are still telling really important stories and arguably have an easier time getting their stories out because they're not beholden to having a media house be their backing, right? Essentially, in some sense, anyone with a Twitter account can break a story that once upon a time could have been shut down by a corporate media house. So let's ask ourselves which of those. And then also, and I'm guilty of this as well, I grew up in Bombay. English is my mother tongue, right? It's my first and really only language of any utility to me. But that means that when I think of the India's press, I think of the Indian English language news, which is a small minority of India's media. And so, without suggesting that my colleagues are guilty of the same blinders that I know I am, right? Anything I'm going to say is really reflecting maybe the tip of the iceberg, right? But does not really speak to the regional vernacular press, which my sense is a lot more vibrant, can often be a lot more confrontational than not. Okay, 3 points. The press, for me, in thinking about the role, Michael labeled this panel the fourth estate, the state of the fourth estate. How free is it? When you think of the fourth estate, what we really are thinking about is it as a check and balance on government, right? In that sense, I think of the press, like the courts, even maybe like bureaucracy, as playing a fundamentally counter-majoritarian role in protecting democracy. When the majority wins, they get to put their people in power, but the core principle of constitutional democracy is that just having power for these 5 years doesn't mean that you get to rewrite all the rules. It doesn't mean that you get to write roughshod over minority populations, etc. And the institutions of democracy that protect that are those of the press, of the courts, maybe again of the permanent bureaucracy, that are there to essentially say, you might have power today, but in 5 years there'll be someone else in charge. And so there's a through line over here where we speak for those who are not currently in power. That means that the press necessarily has to have an antagonistic relationship with government, right? There are no governments that are fans of the press if the press is doing its job. That's sort of almost definitional over here. And so in that sense, Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah's sort of notoriously thin skin about criticism puts them in very good company, including with the resident of the White House not that far from the Wilson Center, right? The free press makes enemies of the powerful, and that's the way, in some sense, it should be. The harder question is what happens when the bulk of the population, right, the majority of the population that voted these guys in, shares that same thin skin about any criticism of the government because they see it as criticisms implicitly of themselves. In other words, for all the fun that we might be able to make at snide comments at the expense of, these, Rahul Kanwal dressing up in army fatigues to sort of simulate what an attack on Balakot might look like, or Arnab sort of yelling and sort of hectoring whoever his guests are. The fact of the matter is that these media channels draw incredibly large audiences, right? And that's the reason these guys get away with it, because TRPs, or the media ratings, tell a story that is in fact not one that we want to listen to, right? It's much easier for us to criticize the politicians as being bullies, much harder to sort of look at the body public and say there seems to be a real appetite for this. There seems to be a real sympathy for a certain set of views and a certain set of perspectives, including about Kashmir, right? It's kind of shocking when you go back. I just got back from Bombay about a week ago, and you did a polite conversation with people you've known for 40 years, right, over dinner, and all of a sudden they'll say things about Kashmir that kind of horrify from where I sit. But the point is that this is a broader public that supports a particular kind of media at a given point in time. And I think we have to ask ourselves how to empower a press, not just to be taking on government, but in fact to be taking on large swaths of the population as well, right? Who's their audience, right? And what happens when the press thinks that it's no longer in sync even with what the audience wants? So if the audience has become very nationalistic, right, very anti-Pakistan, won't brook any criticism of the government, right? How to think about what the role of the press in that particular situation is, I think, is a very hard question. And it's a hard question not just in India, it's a hard question throughout Asia, I would argue, in the United States as well. So that's point one. The second is the business of media. So India is one of the few countries in the world where newspaper circulation is increasing, right? There's an incredibly rich vernacular news media. There's a proliferation and an absolute fragmentation of the TV market, right? When I'm home late at night and jet lagged, I sort of turn on the television in my hotel room and flip through channels, and every channel has lots of talking heads yelling at each other. The glory of India is that they're just yelling at each other in different languages, right? So maybe they don't understand each other's insults, but it's like, but the fact of the matter is that there's hundreds of 24/7 news channels right now. So it's a complete fragmentation of the space. So the question really is, what is the business model? What is the ownership structure of these? And over here, the terms that have already been used, sort of the corporatization, the media conglomerates, and the fact that politicians, especially at the regional level, have major stakes in significant media ventures, means that the confluence of media and politics is much cozier, much and therefore much less healthy than one. If you are imagining a media that's independent of the politicians, so they can hold them in check, that model is brought into real question if in fact the politicians are the ones who own the media house entirely, right? But it's beyond that. It's the source of advertising. We know that print media around the world suffers from a lack of revenue streams, right? Most of us want to read great stories. We don't want to pay for that content. So where does the advertising come from? And if you flip through any Indian newspaper, you'll realize that the major advertiser in newspapers is the government, right? Because of laws that require that the government advertise any tender or procurement process beyond a certain level, postings for positions, etc. But that means that the threat of pulling that advertising by the government to shift it to an alternative media source could be devastating for a news outlet, right? Essentially, the government is their main customer. So this is, I think, really where we need to shine a bright light, and we need to think creatively as a society about how to think about supporting media. We can't have an independent media that's going to be the fourth estate that checks the government if government both owns them and is their primary customer, right? Media in this sense is truly between a rock and a hard place in a way that doesn't seem very sustainable. Okay, and so the final point, right? How to think about sort of this hyper-nationalism and this particular moment. I mean, one of the tricks over here for me in my analysis, Michael kindly mentioned a book I wrote 3 years ago called Elections in Hard Times. The genesis of that was right here at the Wilson Center when I was a fellow over here. It's published by the Wilson Center Press in collaboration with Cambridge. But what we argued, my co-author and I argued in that book, is that one of the challenges for elections in the 21st century is that the stakes of elections are both very small and all the marbles. they're very small in that the role of government in most developing countries has shrunk, right? They don't have the fiscal space, they don't have the revenues to actually do large projects. So most citizens turn to the private sector or NGOs for healthcare, for education. We essentially have exited the public state, right? We have exited the public sector. My colleague in the back, I think Neeta Rudra, over there, who's a current fellow, has a book called Democracies in Peril, also talking about what has happened to democracies and the challenge to democracies as tax revenues in these countries has completely collapsed around the world. So that's happened, but if you can't compete on the basis of here's the big public policy agenda I'm going to pursue because I've got tax revenues, what do you compete on? And what you compete on is identity issues, right? You become the party of Hindus. You become the party of the upper caste versus the lower caste. You become the party of the lower caste, right? Or the lower caste plus Muslims. The caste arithmetic, the religious arithmetic that animates Indian elections means that majorities are formed on the basis of identity appeals rather than programmatic appeals. But this becomes toxic when it comes to media, because now it's not just a criticism of a policy. It's a criticism of who we are as a people. It's a criticism of an idea of India. And that sort of is a pretty no-win situation. So let me end with this, right? I think one of the things, and CPJ has been doing some incredible work documenting this, so I'm really stealing their data and their analysis, but India ranks at the very top of a list you don't want to be at the top of, right, in terms of the impunity with which journalists are attacked and killed, right? I think the 2018 data ranked India as 14th in the world, right, in terms of the impunity. There's two parts to this. Firstly, that being a journalist is an incredibly dangerous job in India. Nia is an inspiration for doing what she does on a daily basis. Most of us couldn't. But second, that the courts and the police have been completely unable to hold anyone to account for this. And the combination of those, both sort of the fact that you have tremendous violence enacted and threatened against journalists, but the fact that there's complete knowledge that you'll get away with it, means that the stakes are very, very high over here, right? Can't rely on it. So really, there's a lot more culprits than just the media. It's not just that the media is weak, it's that the courts are weak. It's that journalists can be hauled away and put in jail without the courts actually stepping in to say, no, you can't do that, right? It's that our laws are weak. Like the Public Safety Act, under which Farooq Abdullah, Omar Abdullah, Mehbooba Mufti have been imprisoned, arguably indefinitely, preceded Mr. Modi, and frankly will survive long after Mr. Modi, just as acts against sedition and all sorts of things, because frankly, all of these governments have found it in their favor to have a nice tool with which to beat up journalists. It is not a Modi problem, it's an India problem, right? So I'm reminded then, finally, in closing, L.K. Advani said of the emergency, of the media in the emergency, she asked you to bend, you chose to crawl, right? The same, ironically, of course, is true today, right? In that it's not even obvious that Mr. Modi and company have to ask anyone to bend. The media is choosing to crawl. My argument today, for the sake of conversation, is that maybe we should stop focusing so much just on the government as the bad guys in enforcing this, and think about the society and the business structure of media, because we could have a completely pro-free press government. We could still have the same rot in the media because it's from the bottom up, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Irfan. And now we go to Shanti.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael and also the Wilson Center. So I've been asked to provide a few comments that might set some of these other comments here in a broader global context. And so I offer these not as an India specialist, because I am not, but as someone who has been studying media and information environments around the world for some time. And what's striking to me is that so many of the trends that have been highlighted here do fit into a broader set of challenges that emanate from the information ecosystem around the world. I know we were asked to talk about media, and it got me thinking about the word media, right? I mean, the idea of mediating. The media is supposed to be a space that acts between various layers of society, mediates the information, and makes sense of it. But increasingly, what we've seen around the world is a trend of disintermediation, meaning that the media is becoming thinned out. and that there is no longer this mediating layer between state and society, between different actors, and essentially everyone is able now to participate in the information space to some degree. Now, a few years ago, we would have seen this development as being primarily a democratizing one around the world, in that obviously the more that people are able to participate in the information ecosystem and the global information space, it will become more democratic. But in fact, what we've seen is a proliferation of challenges that link to the ease of manipulation of that information ecosystem. And unfortunately, these types of manipulation, the lack of transparency, and the increased opportunity for all sorts of powerful actors to play in this space without transparency has led to a set of systematic challenges to democracy around the world. So not just in India, but in all sorts of other democracies. And of course, these trends are also playing out in a very problematic way in more authoritarian countries around the world, where you see many of these trends exacerbated and developed further. So I thought I would just touch on a few broad trends that we're seeing, and to note at the very outset that these trends are not new. So many of these things we have been living with for a long time, such as censorship and so on, but they have taken on a new dimension in our hyper-connected world and in our new information ecosystem. And I think that because of these new trends, that because our new information ecosystem has accelerated these trends and has amplified them in a way that many of us did not anticipate, we're still behind the curve in thinking about them and in addressing them. So briefly, we see increased censorship around the world at various layers. This goes to both fine-tuned censorship as well as broad bans. And so I think, Aliyah, you touched on internet shutdowns and complete cessation of all communications. That would be at one end of the scale. And unfortunately, that trend has been on an upswing in the recent past. So you've now seen the resort to internet shutdowns has become much more prevalent. And unfortunately, that is not just authoritarian countries, but also democracies. I think India, I don't know the exact statistics, but I think that it is out in the forefront among internet shutdowns, the top one. So, and we're seeing an internet shutdown right now in Iran, in fact. And so you see this being relied on much more frequently as a very blunt, very force-driven tool of censorship. The problem, of course, as Aliyah highlighted, is that there are all sorts of not just human rights impacts, but daily life impacts, sometimes real human security impacts that go unnoticed when you have these broad internet shutdowns. At the other end of the scale is very fine-tuned censorship, whereby particularly authoritarian governments have been able to use the new tools of the information space to censor material in ways that makes it almost seamless or invisible through sort of different layers of censorship, as well as working through institutions such as the media corporations and so on. In particular, I'm thinking of China, where this happens to a more sophisticated degree and has been in place for a long time. But that model of fine-tuned, layered censorship is one that is increasingly being developed and pioneered primarily by authoritarian governments around the world, but unfortunately, those lessons are being taken and run with also by democratic governments, which is problematic. The flip side of censorship is, of course, disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation referring to the inadvertent sharing of incorrect material, disinformation as a targeted, coordinated activity that also includes some truths, but in an effort to manipulate publics and sow dissent and a disbelief or a lack of common belief in a shared truth. So in this space, obviously, we've seen an explosion of activity, both in a cross-border disinformation sense, whereby governments themselves are seeking to manipulate and to interfere in the communication space of other places, but also with respect to domestic actors within societies. And none of this is neatly delineated, of course. So you have across the world a combination of cross-border influence operations, misinformation and disinformation that arises from domestic illiberal political actors. And then you have the publics that are brought into this, which oftentimes are unaware of coordination behind the scenes or of the inauthentic nature of disinformation, and yet buy into it and spread it all the same. So one way that we've looked at this is to think about the supply and the demand for disinformation. And I would argue that right now our understanding of the supply of disinformation and misinformation is much greater than our understanding of the demand for it. And this, I think, speaks to Irfan's point a little bit about the ways in which publics have really become swept up in certain narratives, nationalist or otherwise. And my concern is that we don't really understand what drives the public demand for these types of things. Is it that suddenly publics around the world have simply become hyper-nationalist all of a sudden? Is it that perhaps we don't understand how the platforms, as well as publics, as well as external actors, are all combining together to perhaps privilege certain narratives and suppress other ones? I really feel like we don't have a good handle on these issues so far. And so I do hope that we'll get more research on how publics are increasingly part of this issue. Just a small plug, we will have a paper coming out about this in the coming month that will look at exactly how the cognitive dimensions of disinformation are a factor in getting it to spread, how the way we think influences whether or not people are likely to spread good information or bad information. And I think I would just mention that that's a hugely underexplored area that we really need more research on. I'll just briefly touch on the third dimension of this, which is surveillance, which is increasingly part of censorship and disinformation. It's really hard to disentangle all of these trends now. In the past, you talk about, I think India is one of the few places where traditional media is thriving and expanding still, at the same time that you see a broad reliance and sort of a growing influence of the online information system through apps and other things. But it used to be in the traditional media space where people would rely on newspapers. You would think you would read the newspaper, but you don't anticipate that the newspaper is going to read you back. And yet, increasingly, as we rely on online sources of information now, especially those that are predicated on the collection of data from their readers, that's exactly what's happening. Our sources of news are reading us back. And the information that they collect about us can be aggregated in ways that I think are not clear to the average consumer of news. They are not even clear to specialists because a lot of that information is proprietary. And I think that the ramifications of this are really profound because the more data that is collected on people as they interact with the information ecosystem around the world, it is able to create a complete personality and individual portrait of people based on the data that they emit. And that can be used in all sorts of ways, not least to loop back into this whole mess and provide a more complete way to target people with very specifically targeted disinformation that will appeal precisely to their own individual preferences. And of course, if you are targeted with this kind of information, you may be more likely to believe it, you may be more likely to spread it, and spread it to your trusted interlocutors and contacts through messaging apps, for instance. There are two other elements to this current environment which were touched on here, one of which is lawfare and legal threats to journalists and ways in which the legal systems in democracies are increasingly used to silence journalists. And the other, I would say, is the trend of media capture, which I think many people here referred to. In fact, everybody referred to this idea. The capture of media corporations by private interests and the ways in which that can very problematically intersect with democratic principles. I'll put in a plug for our sister organization at the National Endowment for Democracy. The Center for International Media Assistance, CIMA, put out a report on media capture last year, so I would recommend people take a look at that. I don't really like to end on such a negative note because it is quite a daunting picture, but I do think that there are some elements of hope for the future, so I'll just briefly say that when you look at places that have been really dealing with these challenges, especially more open societies where there is room for strong civil societies to take on these issues, to act, both at a policy level as well as a level to better inform and educate the public, you see a lot of really interesting innovations emerge. One area in particular of the world that I think has been dealing with disinformation, misinformation, and a lot of these problematic trends for a while is Central and Eastern Europe. And there you've seen actually a tremendous response from the civil society space to both tackle these issues very much at a policy level, but also to work to not just debunk bad information, which I think has increasingly been found to be not as effective as might be hoped, but to really think about the information ecosystem more broadly and to work at that level. There are some really interesting initiatives that have emerged from that space. And I think that one thing that we're clear about is that it's not enough to simply rely on things that we thought would work in the past iterations of our information ecosystem. So better public awareness, better media literacy, digital literacy, fact-checking and debunking. Those are all, I would say, necessary, but not sufficient. And we don't yet know the best approaches to getting at some of these really pressing problems to democracy around the world. But that space is wide open. I think India itself has a number of civil society organizations that are thinking very creatively about these issues, and I do think that democracies and open societies have an advantage in this space because they are free to think about these creative solutions. And they need to double down on that because there are very large authoritarian actors who actually don't wish to see any solutions emerge in this space. They actually want to see this space to be more manipulated, more controlled, with fewer opportunities for free press and for free expression. So the challenge is really clear, I think, going forward.
Well, thank you, Shanti, and thank you to all four of you. Those are some really terrific comments that presented a really nice, well-rounded picture, setting the stage for a discussion. I'm going to pose two quick questions to the panel before we open it up. The first one is a technical question, and Aliyah, maybe you'd be the best one to answer this, but whoever wants to can weigh in. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the Indian government has allowed Indian journalists into Kashmir, including Indian journalists working for foreign outlets. It's only foreign journalists that cannot go there. And so the question is, what is the reasoning behind that? That's the first question. The second question is a broader one, and it gets to the what next question that Shanti, in a global context, brought up in her closing comments. I think it was noted by several folks that some of these challenges and pressures we're seeing in the media environment have been around for quite some time and predate the Modi era. But where do you see things going in the next few years? And are there any potential markers that we should be looking for that could indicate how the media environment in India could continue to evolve? So first, the technical question about Indian government policy in Kashmir, and then the broader what next question.
I can take the first one. Yeah, you're right. So Indian journalists are allowed to go and report from Kashmir. Foreign journalists are not being allowed. That's not actually a new policy. It's been quite long-standing that typically foreign journalists have to request permission to go to it's not just Kashmir, it's any areas that the Indian government has termed restricted, so you typically need to request permission. And also what we've seen, it also depends on how heavily it's enforced. So the policy has stood for a while. It wasn't being strictly enforced for a long time. Now we're seeing a more strict enforcement of it, and we're also seeing that many of those permissions are kind of just stuck in limbo. They're not getting a yes answer and they're not getting a no answer. Essentially, it's a no, because if you're not getting a yes, you can't go. I think the Washington Post's India bureau chief was stuck in this kind of limbo. She'd requested permission to go multiple times. But I think what that really shows is that, again, it's mostly about the government really trying to control the narrative around Kashmir. So they don't want a lot of international press focusing on Kashmir. They really want Kashmir to be stay as, what they term as an internal matter. So they don't want a lot of international attention or pressure on Kashmir. They want to keep controlling the narrative. And as Irfan was pointing out, it's not necessarily just about the government. If the media itself is bowing to these pressures or agreeing to maybe report along the lines of what is a majoritarian support, then having only Indian media being able to go in and access and report from Kashmir, you're naturally going to see only one line of reporting or one angle of reporting.
Thank you. Does anyone want to weigh in briefly on the what to be looking for in the future question? Yes, please.
I would say that, so when I started journalism, a lot of our editors used to say that each time you get a legal notice for a story, it's a badge of honor, and we used to take pride in that. So it started from that point, but I'll just give you a specific example. Like, I've covered child trafficking for several years. I've covered child trafficking on how children in the Islamic seminaries are trafficked. I've done stories on how the Maoists are using child soldiers, and this is the time where I reported on the Hindu seminaries using children, trafficking children. Now, the difference between the previous cases and now is earlier also we've been dealing with criminal defamation law for the longest time. Everybody's trying to get rid of it, but I don't know when will that happen. But the difference now is that in the present times, it's more like I never received rape threats or death threats or people trying to incite stone pelting at my house or put out my stuff or threaten my family members or stuff like that. And there has been very accredited evidence. I mean, it's been documented in very authentic manner how in the present government there are organized trolls, or let me not just call them trolls, they're organized propaganda machinery online to do this. And also the number of killings, number of physical attacks on journalists that we've seen in the last few years, and the people attacking them, the attackers enjoying the kind of impunity it did not happen earlier. So in fact, for example, if you look at Gauri Lankesh's case, the people, it took them forever, several, like 16, 17 months to finally arrest the people, and those people have direct links with these Hindutva nationalist groups, but still there is no action. So I would say, yes, there were earlier also the press was under attack, but now it's done in a more, let's say, in a more organized way with people enjoying complete impunity and the government almost aiding them to go ahead and attack people and create an atmosphere of self-censorship.
Okay, well, great. Well, let's open up to some questions, and I'd like to get at least one or two rounds. If it's okay with all of you, we'll take a few questions at once. That way we can maximize our time. You want to wait till we have a microphone in front of you, just because we are broadcasting this around the world and we want people to hear. So we'll start with the gentleman right there in the back, and then we'll come up here. And please give your name and your affiliation as well.
My name is Ashok Panikar, and I'm with an organization called Metaculture. We work for 12 years in India, particularly in areas related to conflict and peace building. And for the past 3 years, we've been here. And I want to ask particularly Dr. Kalathil and Dr. Nuruddin, because you mentioned the public and the majoritarian sentiment, which supposedly has changed now. And the work that I did, I worked with the RSS, the VHP, Muslim fundamentalist groups, evangelical Christians, all of them. And one of the things that became very, very clear to me, even before the Modi government came in 2014, is that we really are not democratic when it comes down to the public psyche. We are extraordinarily feudalistic. We even those, I joke sometimes saying you can go to Harvard Business School and come back to India and you are class and caste oriented. We don't have a culture of democracy. So what's happening right now, for me, suggests that all these years, 70 odd years, we had a veneer of democracy, and the liberals had so much control of the public space that whether it's in the media or in government, we were able to use a top-down version of secular liberal democracy with the institutions, including the judiciary, being as objective as it was, to the extent that it was. That veneer has been taken off right now. And I guess my question to you, again, linked with the idea of what next, is how can we even look at sustaining democracy when, as a people, and I'm a fourth generation college going person from India, in a poor country, fourth generation, we are not rich, but we are middle class. Not a single person in my family, other than an 84-year-old journalist uncle, even cares a damn about what's happening in the country, except they want their children to get into Ivy League schools. They want the second apartment or the third house. That's all. And I thought we were a liberal family. We were a secular family. They're not Muslim bashers, but at the end of the day, all that they care is their self-interest and the family self-interest. In other words, and I'll just stop with
Okay,
this.
yeah, why don't you wrap up?
I will
Pose
wrap
the
up.
question, yeah.
I get carried away with
I understand,
my
but-
frustrations. But here's the thing. How can we address Kashmir or the fate of Muslims when it's not just the government, as you said, manipulating things, but the people want a certain kind of a culture and a certain kind of a regime.
Okay, thank you. Next, we had a question up here, towards the front. Was there not a hand up over here? Oh, okay, why don't we'll go to you, Karen, and then we'll come over here.
My name is Karen Fisher. I lived in Kashmir for 10 years. I worked as a correspondent for Greater Kashmir for 2 years, and later on edited and wrote also for an online portal, a very recent one. And my question is for Alia. And I'm glad you pointed out that all of what we are talking about is not a function of August 5th, but that all of this has been going on for a long time. So I would like an update, if you have one, on Asif Sultan, who was a close friend and who was arrested, I believe, late 2017. He did an in-depth story on Burhan Wani and was arrested subsequently. And then, because we had all organized to get him released, he was framed with murder charges. So I'm wondering, is there an update on Asif? And the second thing is for Irfan regarding the advertising revenue trap, which of course is particularly bad in Kashmir because there's hardly any private investment and no funding coming. There was a proliferation of online news portals, especially in Kashmir. She mentioned one of them, Kashmiriyat. But they started being harassed seriously beginning in 2016. Many were detained for days and stopped reporting as honestly as they had been. So my question is, how can they be better protected? Because much of the reporting coming out of India that is factual is coming from these portals. And I fear eventually they're all going to be so harassed that they will shut down.
Thank you. Any other questions we could take in this round? Yes, Nita, right behind. Oh, yeah, go ahead. You could ask yours, and then we'll go to Nita for afterward. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your discussions. My question is for Neha. I wanted to ask you about the point you made about lack of organizational support when journalists, and specifically independent journalists, go out to report. So, of course, it's extremely difficult. The government doesn't support you or anybody. Then what can an organization that wants to support an independent journalist do? Maybe not in this current scenario, looking at various media blockages, but what would you suggest to someone who's been on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll go to Nita right behind you, Joshua. Thanks.
My question's for Irfan, but I'd be interested in what any of you have to say. The question is, why now? As been noted, India's had a veneer of democracy and secularism, Is it economic growth? India's been doing well. Is it all Modi, or is there something deeper that you feel is driving these forces? And so therefore, post-Modi, it will continue.
Okay, let's stop there. Who would like to weigh in first?
You want to just go down?
Yeah, why don't we, that's a good idea. Neha, why don't you start?
Okay, so because a lot of independent journalists are, because the kind of structure of the mainstream media is that there is, like I chose independent journalism because there was still scope. If one organization doesn't publish my story, then the second does, or second doesn't. So eventually the story does come out, and a lot of journalists are choosing to do work like this. So, which is why there is no organizational backing, for instance, in my case and several other cases. Now the difference is that most of our press bodies are completely spineless. Most of them are headed by editors who are completely very close to the power center, so they don't want to take any position or come out. And like we talked about, so somebody like me who lives in Delhi and has access and writes in English, I still can talk to people, but a lot of journalists in smaller towns and writing in other Indian languages, they are the mainstream media model, revenue model is such that nobody is given a salary any longer. So the local journalists who are referred by a derogatory term called stringers, so they are asked to go get ads for their news organizations and get some part of the commission as their salary. So which is why they also have to do something on the side. Somebody runs a grocery store, somebody runs something else. So when they are attacked, these mainstream organizations say, oh, this person is not a journalist. So that's how it works. That's the pattern we have seen in 5 years. At least 300-400 people are in this situation right now. Now, the role is, for instance, in my case, mine was the first in the series of several criminal cases filed against journalists. And when that happened, no press body took any position. So CPJ was the first organization to even acknowledge that this has happened. So I know in the times where we live in, where there are online statements and this and that everywhere, and we sometimes question what is the need for this, but just the acknowledgement that this has happened. So first of all, any organization who is serious about this needs to publicly acknowledge that what is happening is not right. That in itself is a big support. And then when it comes to organizational support, of course, there could be a caucus of funds or just a group of collective of lawyers who can actually help us, lawyers, not just in India, but elsewhere internationally. So that kind of support really helps, especially for independent journalists. All of us work without contracts with news organizations. So no contributor in India has ever given contracts by news organizations. For example, when my story was published and Outlook decided to back off, they published 12,000 words of my story as a cover story, and then they refused to pay me, saying there's no digital contract to pay me because they were so much under stress by the government. And then it took me 16 months to actually follow up and get that. So those are the things I think if we can push towards that and acknowledge, the first thing is to acknowledge, then that will be really helpful.
So Karen, thank you for asking about Asif. And Karen gave a brief background on Asif Sultan. He's a Kashmiri journalist who's been imprisoned for more than a year now. He had written a story on a militant commander, Burhan Wani, in 2016. He wrote it, or 2017. It's been, yeah. Essentially, what's happening in Asif's case is really unfortunate. So he was detained for nearly 6 months before there were any official charges against him. And since those charges have come, which are quite extreme, he's lumped in with multiple others accused of militant and separatist activities. So Asif himself is being accused of harboring and supporting militancy in Kashmir. And, this comes after he wrote a fairly extensive story in which he had militant sources, which, if you report in a conflict region, is quite normal. So his hearings keep getting denied. So every month, he's supposed to appear in court. Every month that hearing is delayed for some reason or the other. So at this point, he what we're seeing is just a complete denial of any due process. And unfortunately, it's only become exacerbated since the restrictions. It's even harder to get court hearings, court appearances, as well as any information or updates on the case. So unfortunately, there is no change in his status right now.
I want to start with Karen's question about Kashmir. In September of 2017, at Georgetown, we hosted a closed-door roundtable on Kashmir. So back in 2015, we had done a day-long conference in Kashmir. Omar Abdullah had spoken at it. And then in 2017, we did a follow-up. And in fact, Shujat Bukhari from Rising Kashmir was spoken at it. And of course, a year later, was killed in front of his office in Srinagar. So the notion that, online news portals, while quite powerful, you're absolutely right. They're just as vulnerable to harassment and targeting as any other. But I think what that suggests to me is that we're having a conversation right now where we're talking about media, but really the media in that sense is a canary in the mine shaft, right? If we're in a situation in which the police and the law and order situation in the most heavily militarized area of the world cannot keep somebody safe coming out of their home, getting into their car from a street side assassination, that's not a government protection of the media issue. That is a fundamental breakdown of law and order and of public security. When we talk about, Asif Sultan and others being imprisoned and essentially being imprisoned, locked away, keys thrown away, but without trial, long periods of time, that seems to me an indictment of the courts and of the legal framework of the country, as opposed again to media, because not just media professionals who are vulnerable to that, it's any number, right? The weaponization, I kind of dislike that word, but the weaponization of the enforcement directorate, of the CBI against business people, against other politicians who are seen as unfriendly to the government, because everyone's got skeletons in their closet. And now we have, as we have had in the past, a willingness on the part of the government to threaten essentially that we'll, you do something and tomorrow you're going to be raided, right? I mean, so this strikes me as really a larger conversation about the public institutions of India's democracy and why they seem to have eroded. And Devesh Kapoor, who's now at SAIS, Milan Vaishnav at Carnegie, have a very good recent volume, edited volume called Rethinking India's Public Institutions that I recommend. And they go through all the different ones and really sort of asked hard questions about how do we support these more generally. But I guess my answer to you is, I think we need to think about those supporting institutions if we're going to protect journalists as part of a larger societal set of issues, as opposed to thinking about journalists only. They deserve that attention, but the solutions lie outside. So to get to the other two questions, I agree with you, right? I mean, I think there's something very disconcerting at this particular moment of wondering whether or not the 70 years of democracy, what has it all added up to if we can suddenly be in these conversations? But I would push a little bit and say that I don't think this has been a veneer of democracy. I think it's been a veneer of liberalism, right? And those are different. India's democracy, if you think of that as being the holding of competitive multi-party elections, is vibrant. Anti-incumbency is a huge thing, right? Yes, Mr. Modi won a resounding victory in this last election, but 5 months later, in two BJP-controlled states of Haryana and Maharashtra, his party loses seats in both of them, right? And now in Maharashtra, it looks increasingly likely that the opposition will cobble together a coalition to take over. So politicians lose elections on a regular basis, in fact, far more often than they win another term. But I think you're absolutely right that India's constitution and the constitution of Ambedkar and Nehru, right, and the Constituent Assembly was far ahead of its society, right? It was an aspirational document and sort of thinking about a set of rights and privileges for India's citizens that would be constitutional guaranteed, that didn't necessarily have societal support. I mean, and no more to look at that than thinking about the reservations for lower castes in the political system, et cetera, at a time when the casteist nature of India's society then as today is deep and strong and almost seeming invulnerable to change. And yet we have some of the most progressive laws for reservations, both in politics and in educational institutions for Dalits anywhere in the world. So there's a mismatch over there, and I think that's what we're seeing right now is sort of a revenge of the, if you would, of the elites, essentially against saying, what is the subaltern class that are coming up and how do we push back against that? And so, Neeta, I think this question of why now is a tricky one, right? I mean, I think there's a part of me that wants to push and say, what is the golden age to which we want to hearken, right? And where did that exist? And, there's a danger, I think, of presentism because we don't like the particular incumbent. But I'm reminded that President Obama, right, prosecuted leaks during his 2 terms much more vigorously than any president before him, right? And I don't remember the same sort of, deep concerns about the government attacking journalists in the way that now, because we don't particularly care for the current incumbent, we are much more animated about. So this is not a whataboutism. I think it's about saying, let's be clear, right? I mean, we talk about the restrictions on the Indian journalists and other journalists going to Kashmir. Granted, it's slightly different, but if you'll allow the slight analogy, I mean, some of us are old enough to remember when journalists were being embedded within military units to report in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? I mean, what was the free and fair reporting over there? I mean, living in America right after 9/11 and watching the news coverage, it was just one small step to watching one of these guys dress up in army fatigues and reenact all of this stuff. I mean, the rah-rah jingoism, no country is immune to that. And I think India right now has a certain version of that. I do think, therefore, we should also think about the difference between the reporting that we see or don't see when it comes to Pakistan and a lot of other questions. But, because I see a lot of hard questions being asked about economic policy, about demonetization, about today, a big story broke about electoral bonds, right, about corruption, about criminality of politics. Yogi Adityanath has not been immune to lots of criticism in the national press, even if in UP he's, tried to cow journalists. But there seems to be a very different conversation when it comes to talking about Pakistan. There's a certain element of that jingoism there that's very real, and maybe that we could argue Mr. Modi has invested, or his party has invested much more in recently. So long-winded answer to say that, I do think we want to resist the temptation to make this only about the media, because I think it's broader. And we also want to resist the temptation to make it too much about the present as opposed to the structural forces that are deeper there.
John, you want to have the last word?
I would say, I agree we have to resist the temptation to make this all about the media. Again, I would broaden this out to talking about the information ecosystem globally. And to go back to the comment that I made at the beginning, which is that this is not only a media problem, these are about systemic challenges to democracy that emanate from that information space, which is slightly different because I think it frames the problem in a much broader context. I also think that because I look across a number of different countries, I see these same questions being replayed across all of these countries. And everybody is asking some version of, did we just have a veneer of civility and democracy, or why now? And it's striking the extent to which so many countries, so many publics are grappling with these really, really difficult questions. And so, in a way, I guess it is disheartening because everybody is struggling with these same issues. But it is also heartening because I think it forces you to look beyond simply a domestically, nationally driven narrative, although certainly that is part of it. Because I tend to look at all of these issues and I see the threads that run through the information ecosystem, and of course, because I specialize in this, I tend to see its role in everything. But I do think that that is a common element that joins so many of these countries that are struggling with this problem. And so while there are, of course, always fundamental domestic, political, and other drivers behind some of these unfortunate trends, I think that we haven't yet, broadly as open societies, done a great job at understanding why suddenly we're all struggling with these issues at the same time. Let me just very quickly cite a report which came out recently on the global disinformation order. It was published by the Oxford Internet Institute, and they do this report every couple of years looking at essentially organized social media manipulation campaigns. So in 2017, they found 28 countries. They found evidence of organized social media manipulation campaigns in 28 countries. In 2018, they found evidence in 48 countries. And in this most recent 2019 report, which just came out a couple of months ago, they found that such campaigns have taken place in 70 countries. I think that we, again, don't know what we don't know, and we're likely to attribute some of these really distressing social changes and these eruptions of public opinion, and we tend to believe that we understand what's driving them. And I guess I would posit that we are just we're really at the tip of the iceberg. We don't understand what's behind a lot of these very strong and sometimes illiberal public opinion trends that are happening across the world. And I think that there is much more manipulation and organization behind that than we think that there is, and therefore we need to understand both what's driving that as well as how the public is consuming and spreading these narratives.
Thank you. Irfan, oh, you did? Okay, great. Well, we are going to have to wrap up. This is a terrific conversation. Every time I host a discussion like this, and there have been many of them in my many years here, I always hope to learn something, and I certainly learned a lot today. Really interesting discussion. First, we had some, really interesting perspectives from Neha, who's done tremendously brave reporting over the years, and then we had Aliyah weigh in with some comments about what CPJ has been doing recently, investigating these very important questions about press freedoms. And then we had Irfan place all this into some proper political context, and then Shanti subjecting it to a global lens. So it's really been terrific. And if you could just join me in a round of applause for the panelists once again. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Absolutely. It was great to see you.